Senator Bernie Sanders trying to alter U.S. laws on cannabis. The Democratic presidential candidate filed a bill in the Senate to remove all mentions of marijuana from the law. In a bill called, quote, Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition of 2015, Sanders seeks to end federal criminalization of the drug, aiming to let states make decisions without involving the federal government. The laws currently differ from state to state. So far, Colorado, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington have legalized the sale and possession of cannabis. Bottom line, Sanders wants to legalize marijuana throughout the U.S.
In 2014, the latest statistics that I have seen, there were 620,000 arrests for marijuana possession. That is one arrest every minute. According to a report by the American Civil Liberties Union, there were more than 8 million marijuana arrests in the United States from 2001 to 2010. Almost 9 in 10 of those arrests were for possession. Arrests for marijuana possession rose last year nationwide, even as Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and the District of Columbia became the first states to legalize personal use of marijuana. And let us be clear, as is the case in many other areas, that there is a racial component to this situation. Although about the same proportion of blacks and whites use marijuana, a black person is almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person. Too many Americans have seen their lives destroyed because they have criminal records as a result of marijuana use. That is wrong. That has got to change. And let's be clear, but I think a lot of people may not fully appreciate this, is that a criminal record could mean not only time in jail, but a criminal record makes it harder for a person to get a job, harder for a person to get public benefits, harder for a person to even get housing. A criminal record stays with a person for his or her entire life. It is a serious business. Right now, marijuana is listed by the federal government as a Schedule I drug, meaning that it is considered to be as dangerous as heroin. That is absurd. In my view, the time is long overdue for us to remove the federal prohibition on marijuana. In my view, states should have the right to regulate marijuana the same way that state and local laws now govern the sale of alcohol and tobacco. And among other things, that means that recognized businesses in states that have legalized marijuana should be fully able to use the banking system without fear of federal prosecution. In addition, in those states that decide to go forward, and I'm not here advocating that states do it, that is the decision of the individual states within our federal system. But those states that choose to go forward can tax marijuana like they tax alcohol and cigarettes, and in fact earn a substantial amount of money. Colorado is making right now about $50 million a year through the taxation of marijuana. And in Colorado and I believe other states, some of that revenue is being used to fight the effects of substance abuse, of hard drugs like opiates that are harming so many communities. In the year 2015, it is time for the federal government to allow states to go forward as they best choose. It is time to tax and regulate marijuana like alcohol. It is time to end the arrests of so many people and the destruction of so many lives for possessing marijuana.
Look at all that money, yeah, the money that they spent. Take another look now and take some time for hemp. I know cut trees for paper, cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yeah, it's time for hemp. Oh, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rest. Well, right now it's time for hemp.
Thank you for taking time for hemp. I'm your host, Casper Leach. It's time to talk about solutions. Some of the solutions we will address, I'm sure, will have to deal with the international treaties, and some of the solutions we'll be talking about what we're going to do to help implement the reintroduction of this plant into an economy because of some of the most exciting news that has happened here recently. And we have Ethan Nadelmann on. Ethan, what do you see as a way of bringing forward a solution to the global war on drugs, please?
Well, Cass, I'll tell you, I mean, it's an incredibly exciting time right now. I'm down here in Jamaica, had a remarkable set of meetings in Kingston, Jamaica, the capital, on Wednesday with senior business leaders and top members of the government as well as members of the opposition party. And what you're seeing there is that they are feeling, more and more that it's time to move forward in Jamaica with ganja law reform. You know, not just decriminalization, but also developing the legal market, developing legal tourism, and really using many of the same arguments we're here in the U.S. Now, what I heard from them repeatedly was, what we're worried about is what's the U.S. government going to do? One of them told me a story that when he was a cabinet minister in a past government, and they were just proposing not legalization, but decriminalization, he gets a call from the U.S. ambassador here, and all next thing he knows, he's meeting on conference calls with people in D.C., discouraging him from moving forward in Jamaica. And that's their fear. And what I told them on Wednesday was, you got a lot less to fear now than you think you do. That since Washington and Colorado voted the way they did, and with the White House not responding negatively so far, and with Uruguay moving forward on marijuana legalization and no evidence of pressure from the U.S. government on Uruguay, I said, don't be so concerned. It's time to move forward. Don't be asking permission. Basically appealing to their senses of nationalism around this as well as pragmatism. And they were looking at me, a little unsure, but I got to tell you, the announcement yesterday from the White House, what that means internationally is huge. It's significant in other states around the U.S. because people have been holding back and been afraid to introduce bills in legislatures and this and that are now going to say, the feds are saying that they want to see how this works. Let's push forward as well. It's going to be significant for the industry because it means there's a chance now that they'll be able to operate more and more like a real legal industry. But internationally, what it means now is that the State Department is no longer in a position to be telling foreign governments that they cannot consider their own reforms of marijuana laws. Well, how can they, in good conscience or with any credibility, tell a foreign government, we don't want you to legalize or legally regulate marijuana, even if that's in your own best interest, when Washington and Colorado are proceeding and when the Justice Department has indicated a willingness to see how this will work out. So what that means is in countries from Jamaica to Canada, any place where people feel cowed by the United States, what you're going to see is a different level of debate. That old argument that the U.S. will never let us do it ain't going to fly no more.
Well, and on top of that, so many other countries have demonstrated the economic value of having this plant available, not just for medical, but for industrial use, like Canada. Their government even supports the hemp industry, and they're creating, as you know, the hemp auto body. I would think that that would be also another major factor coming into play at this point.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, you look, it's not just Canada. There's probably 40 countries that have legalized hemp. And the U.S. is importing, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars worth of hemp products, finished hemp products, but still not allowing it to be grown. But I think the recent shift in politics, not just on marijuana policy reform broadly, but what you saw happening in the U.S. Senate, agreeing to back a hemp legalization bill, I think what that suggests is there's a decent chance that Congress will actually take action to legalize hemp in the next year or two. And I think that's going to go hand in hand. Remember, at this point, very few countries have felt intimidated about legalizing hemp, except for those in the Caribbean who are traditionally feeling intimidated by the U.S., almost afraid of their own shadow on this stuff. So I think hemp's going to move forward in a big way, but more significantly in a way is that you're going to see a lot more running room for the broader regulation of marijuana, not just for medicinal purposes, but more broadly. Ethan. Okay, guys, take it away. Eric, Howard, Casper, best of luck. Thanks for having me on. Look forward to seeing you guys.
And Howard, who is our next panelist here on the big broadcast?
Well, we have with us Eric Sterling, the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area. Eric, if you don't know, has been involved in this now for, a good 30 years, Eric? You were the staffer on the Hill during the 80s. Just tell us a little bit about that so we have the historical context of where you're coming from.
Well, the context where I'm coming from is that in 1976, I testified for marijuana decriminalization before the Pennsylvania legislature when I was still a law student in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. I joined NORML and ran a NORML chapter out of my law office in Pennsylvania. I was able to get a job working in Washington with the House Judiciary Committee. And when the congressman I worked for retired, I was traded like a baseball player to a new team, a new owner. That was the House Crime Subcommittee, and I became involved in writing federal drug laws and overseeing the Drug Enforcement Administration in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. And so I was at the table during the development of the 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Act and played a major role in helping Congress write the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988. During those days, I would go to NORML conferences, but make sure that I stayed off camera. And then in 1989, started working full-time to help legalize marijuana when I started the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, and we began to attack the rhetoric and the programs of the first drug czar, Dr. William Bennett, under the first President George Bush. So I've been doing this ever since. Helped start the Marijuana Policy Project. Been a member of the Drug Policy Alliance since it was created as the Drug Policy Foundation, and helped people like Tom Angel start Marijuana Majority, and you and Jack Cole and Peter Christ start LEAP and other organizations.
It certainly has been a long time for many people who've been pushing on this wall to see some real fruits of our labor.
What you have to understand is that the U.S. Department of Justice is accepting legal marijuana in the United States. U.S. Department of Justice is saying to Colorado and Washington, your legal marijuana programs can go ahead. That is huge because this is contrary to federal law. And the Department of Justice is saying, we can't stop you. We're not going to stop you. What we want you to do is to keep it out of the hands of kids. We want you to prevent intoxicated driving. And we want you to keep your marijuana from flowing into neighboring states. And if you can do that, we're not going to stop you. That is huge. More importantly, you have to recognize the political significance to legislators and activists around the country. In every state, in January, we're going to see bipartisan efforts to introduce legislation to legalize marijuana along the lines of Washington or Colorado. Those bills are not going to necessarily pass, but they're going to get a serious kind of hearing that they haven't gotten before, because the Justice Department said, this is okay. We're not going to fight it. Some of those efforts are not going to succeed, but as Ethan Nadelmann said, some of those efforts are definitely going to succeed. Right. And as Ethan tells us, from the capital of Jamaica, where he is right now, governments all over the world, that have been wanting to legalize marijuana now realize the U.S. government is not fighting it in its own territory. It can't fight it in Jamaica. It can't fight it in Uruguay. It's not going to fight it in other countries.
I know for myself, as a full-time advocate on Capitol Hill, the question of where we go forward is well, first, we are going to have to go forward. As you may have said, and Ethan, there's still lots to do. The question now, what type of new strategies do we employ? Where do you see the marijuana reform, drug reform going forward?
Well, fortunately, out of the box, there's going to become a fairly strong, positive support from the most important committee with jurisdiction over the Department of Justice, the Senate Judiciary Committee. So that this kind of political support from the Congress is going to be very important. What activists need to do is to contact their senators and say, I applaud what the Obama administration is doing here on legal marijuana, and I want you to express that kind of support. So it's important for activists to write to their senators, to email them, and to send letters to the editor and to comment, on blogs saying, I support this. We need to, to indicate that this is what the public wants, and we want it to go forward. We need to create the political affirmation that when you take this earth-shaking, groundbreaking kind of step, the public is right behind you and giving you political cover. That's absolutely essential for the audience of Time for Hemp to do that kind of work.
Yeah, I agree. I've just finished 2 months in the Senate. For the audience, I usually spend 2 months in the Senate and 10 months in the House, going door to door, member to member, educating them as to the need to end federal prohibition of drugs, starting with marijuana. And certainly, I've been in every office where the phone rings almost off the hook, and people calling in and giving their opinion. And these staffers do keep a tabulated score of how many people call in, on what issue, and on which side of the issue they're on. And this is tabulated daily and given to the member, so he knows how many calls we received that day, on what issues, and how people felt about it. And they do, on a regular basis, say on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate, well, I've had so many calls on this issue, and the overwhelming number are saying blank, go this way or go that way. So even if it's your congressman or senator who's a die-in-the-wool prohibitionist, that he always loves prohibition and probably always will, we urge you, call him anyway. It's the call.
No effort is wasted. No effort is ever a waste to contact a public official.
No, but that's true, and we are focusing, though, on a global war on drugs. It's not just here at home. It's here in America, and we have a global audience today that is also stressed by the impact that it is putting upon their part of the world.
And, Casper, so to whatever extent our global audience lives in a democratic society, they should be contacting their delegates and representatives in the chambers of deputies or whatever the name of their parliament or legislature might be to do the same kind of thing. Whether they use social media as the way to express the popular will, these are, it is worthwhile to say, we applaud what the U.S. federal government is doing. Our government should be doing the same thing.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Ethan said, that it is now essentially impossible for our government to criticize any progress, any moves forward across the planet to end marijuana prohibition, because we have thrown in the towel. We have simply said, we are no longer going to enforce federal prohibition in the various states that change it. And you read this carefully, and you are also an attorney. Would this Holder memo also apply then to the 20 states with medical marijuana here in America?
Oh yes, that's
Sure.
There's a whole paragraph about this, and this is very important because there are some very important positive features compared to the 2009 Ogden Memorandum.
Mm-hmm.
People who follow this closely may remember that back in 2009, when the Obama administration said we're not going to prosecute medical marijuana growers or sellers if they are, quote, in clear and unambiguous compliance. And lawyers said, look, these laws themselves are so ambiguous and unclear, to comply with them is almost impossible on a clear and unambiguous basis.
Mm-hmm.
Now what they have changed is the language is demonstrably in compliance with the state regulatory system. So they've very much have indicated to the 20 states where medical marijuana is now legal that if you've got a strong and effective state regulatory system and you as a grower or dispensary or a doctor are in compliance with that, demonstrably in compliance with that state system, you don't really have to worry about the feds. But they have not, I wouldn't say they've thrown in the towel. The fight is not over. They're holding on to the towel. They've said, in fact, that if state enforcement efforts are not sufficiently robust to protect against the harms that they've identified, the federal government may seek to challenge the regulatory structure itself. They're not saying we give up. They're saying we believe that a well-regulated market is going to protect public safety. That is profound. They are saying a well-regulated market is preferable to prohibition. That is profound. But they're saying if the market is not well-regulated, we'll come in and try to knock it down. And so our challenge, of course, is to make these things work. It means you have to obey the rules.
Well, let me just say that for the audience, I was 18 years a street cop near Lansing, Michigan, and in fact, my profession, I'm sure as we speak in both Colorado and Washington, is moving into the post-prohibition phase of what do the police do to ensure compliance with the law. And I'll give you an example right out of my daily life as a professional police officer. Every establishment, every store that sold alcohol in my jurisdiction, we visited once a month. We had a checklist, and we would make sure that the beer was cold and there was no, insects and no rats running around, that the place was clean, that there were not bad people hanging around, just a regular checklist. And then we would send that into the Liquor Control Commission to say that the 7-Eleven at the corner of Bruce and Spruce was in compliance this month. We found no defects, no findings, no judgments. Or if we found something, then we certainly would write that up, and then further action would be taken by the Liquor Control Board. But that's what your police will be doing post-prohibition, is not busting kids for marijuana under the front seat, rather going to the stores where the marijuana starts from and making sure they are in compliance, that they're properly packaging, properly displaying, and properly keeping a good business up there. And that's the new regulatory phase for my profession, law enforcement, moving forward in Colorado and Washington. So,
Howard, there's an important caveat, which is as you see the police pull back, there's going to be an increased responsibility upon parents and teachers and people who work with youth. It may be that the cops aren't looking in the front seat, but parents are going to be looking in the clothing drawers. They're going to be looking in the backpacks. Teachers and school administrators are going to be doing the same thing. And if there becomes substantial leakage of marijuana to youth, this whole thing can collapse. We've got to recognize that following the rules is really important.
Well, now, here's a question I have to put on the table, too, that I think is very important. Is this going to open the door to interstate commerce for hemp products in our country, let alone medical marijuana products? And is the IRS going to back off now, do you think?
Sure. Casper, excellent questions. an important feature that an important clue to the answer is that in this memorandum that was issued, the Justice Department said specifically that they're no longer using size or revenues as a proxy for saying a dispensary or an organization is not in compliance with state law. They used to simply say that big organizations were inherently suspect, and they're very, very clear here that size is not an issue, and they're so they're saying, and I'm quoting now: in exercising prosecutorial discretion, prosecutors should not consider the size or commercial nature of a marijuana operation alone as a proxy for assessing whether marijuana trafficking implicates the Justice Department's enforcement priorities. So, it is, the department, at some level recognizes that if dispensaries and retailers do not have access to the banking system, they're going to have to engage in money laundering. They become tied in with the criminal organizations, and it's not in their interest. And I think very quickly we're going to see a change with respect to IRS and the banking laws, because they understand if they want the compliance they're talking about, we're going to have to bring our systems of commerce like banks into partnership with the companies that are doing these businesses.
And then the interstate commerce, we got California, Oregon, and Washington side by side, all have medical marijuana in place. Each might come up with an own strain that might help patients in other states. Is that going to be interstate commerce? And what about the hemp industrial farming? If we do industrial hemp products and create them in Connecticut, can we sell them in Wyoming?
Right now, it would be very, very risky to try to ship this interstate. This memorandum does not answer all the questions. This is groundbreaking, but the full planting has not taken place, and we're not yet ready to start harvest, so to speak. And we've got, we're going to see how this plays out. But right now, interstate trafficking is going to be a very risky business.
Well, let me jump in here on the issue of industrial hemp and interstate commerce. You already have that. We have, as you know, Casper, I'm sure your audience mostly knows, we have hemp coming in from Canada and from China and going across all kinds of state lines to get to a place where it's processed.
We have to remember that cannabis that is psychoactive is going to be treated very differently than hemp.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I'm just saying for industrial hemp, we already have tons of industrial hemp moving across into our ports and ports of entry across Canada, and then moving to processing centers all over the country. So that type of interstate commerce with industrial hemp is already well established. Unless, Aaron?
Casper, here's another, sort of sense about sort of the time frame involved. That the Department of Defense, on the question of being in the military and being gay or lesbian, and don't ask, don't tell. We get the Department of Justice saying we're not going to defend the Defense of Marriage Act, some number of months later. Now the Internal Revenue Service says that legally married same-sex couples are going to be treated, like married couples for federal income tax purposes. The different agencies are going to roll these things out at different rates. And so the banking authorities, the IRS, I think that, these things are going to come, and they don't all come on day one.
You and I are old enough to recall back in the late 70s, we thought we were close to legalization with the Carter administration, the 78, 79, and for a number of reasons, that door was shut and shut hard, and it's only now 30-odd years later it's starting to open up again. So we need to keep that in mind, that we need to keep doing this right and keep doing it as hard as possible.
Well, that was certainly Ethan's point. That was Ethan's point.
Yeah.
I'm on a list of lawyers who discuss developments in the law, and many lawyers were very critical of this proposal. It didn't go far enough, they said. They want to know, well, does this mean the Justice Department is going to continue to prosecute illegal growers in Colorado and Washington? And there was a certain sense of indignation that illegal growers might be prosecuted. Well, we have to expect that illegal growers are going to be prosecuted, just the way we expect that people who run a moonshine still or who don't pay taxes on the cigarettes that they're selling are going to sort of get away with breaking the law. This is important. This is the government recognizing that the law will regulate marijuana sales and cultivation and use. And that's what we've been working for 40 years. And if we think that now there's going to be no law, well, that's really what prohibition is. It's no law, and the cops chase everybody. There are people who've been illegal marijuana growers for a long time. They're going to have to figure out how to get into compliance with the law, or figure that they've got a bullseye on their back.
Sure. I remember when I was in California for helping out Prop 19 in 2010, that when I went north of San Francisco into the Emerald Triangle, that my T-shirt of Cops Say Legalize Pot, Ask Me Why, and my horse trailer, which had similar signage, was not greeted with flowers and trumpets. A lot of people, when I pull up at a restaurant, were not appreciating what I was trying to do to legalize, because they had made their living for 20 years selling illegal pot for $4,000 a pound. And legalization, of course, would take that down from 4,000 to maybe 400. So they were not happy with the idea of legalization, and then I believe those 3 northern counties voted against legalization, if for no other reason from economic self-interest. I did want to approach one other topic about this, Eric. The federal level phone calls, emails. I always recommend doing it about twice a year, just writing in saying, please end the prohibition of these drugs and let the states handle it, pushing a 10th Amendment states' rights issue. Are there any other things that our audience could do on a regular, irregular basis to help move this issue forward at the federal level?
Well, certainly they should do that kind of thing. They should make sure they are members of groups like NORML, the Marijuana Policy Project, LEAP, SSDP, so that they get updates when concerted, organized political action is necessary. Belonging to those organizations makes sure, assures that you get timely action, what to do, the email links, the website links to click, so that powerful voice can be heard when it needs to be proclaimed. And I know it's very early, and we talked about this just before the program started, but do you see a change of focus or whatever else on Capitol Hill in the United States Congress moving forward in terms of a difference in talking points, a difference in strategies? And this would also go forth across the whole planet, whether you have a parliament or wherever, that what new things or emphasizing old things can we tell our politicians to help them break away from this old prohibition model? Howard, that's a good question, because from the standpoint of the Democrats, this is very big. Barack Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party. When the president's administration makes this big kind of change, this is a sign to all the Democratic congressmen and Democratic senators, Democratic governors. This is the new line. This is the new party line. This is acceptable. If you line up in favor of marijuana legalization, now you're lining up with Barack Obama and the administration. That's huge. They're not standing out there alone. They're now standing with what is perceived to be the political view of the leading Democrat. This opens up enormous space for members of Congress to talk about this in town hall meetings. They get to say, when they're asked questions, the Justice Department supports this. The Justice Department is going to protect us. Somebody stands up in a town hall meeting and says, well, what about the kids? And the congressman gets to say, the Justice Department's going to protect the kids against diversion because that's what they've promised to do. Well, what about, organized crime? The Justice Department is going to protect this, is what members of Congress can say. And so it changes the way in which public officials are going to talk about this at every level of the government. And that is profound. That's profoundly important. So that it means as they get in the habit of supporting legalization, it means they will be able to vote for bills and explain their votes because they've gotten in the habit of explaining why they support legalization. Even though the Republicans aren't there yet, the nature of the discussion, this is now a legitimate partisan issue in a way that it was not before.
And it seems to me that when a politician would hide behind that cover of saying, well, no matter what else, the federal government will come in and hurt Maryland or come in and hurt Iowa if we change our position here in this state, that is no longer valid, that you can't hide behind that argument, correct?
That argument is no longer operable. That argument is history.
Great.
I mean, if you're setting up a well-run regime, if you're setting up a well thought out control system, this is not going to provide a lot of protection for California, because California's systems of control, its own regulatory system, is so poorly conceived. In some sense, this is a very powerful encouragement to the legislature in California and the governor to change the way medical marijuana is being distributed in California. Many medical marijuana states, I think, are going to tighten up their systems so that they feel more comfortable that they're in compliance with this system.
Going forward, what do you think we're going to be looking at in the world when we start January 1st, 2017?
What you're going to find, I think, in the beginning of 2017 with the next president of the United States, the sort of general demographic of the way the country is changing, the sort of general sense about how the Electoral College gives the Democrats a very substantial advantage. In many respects, to the extent that this is an issue of greater importance to younger voters, and that the population of baby boomers, is now beginning to actually die off, we're going to see that politically this is going to become a much more important issue than it has been in the past, in the sense that it's important to be a supporter of marijuana legalization. And this is exactly why the Obama administration took this point. You have to understand the politics of this. This was a big political struggle within the Justice Department. This ultimately was about their assessment of the politics. And they're looking for 2016 to say, this is going to be good for Democrats. And that's why they did it.
Well, on that note, I would encourage our audience, when you do write in and you call in to these offices, these candidates, emphasize that you're 20 years old, you're 22 years old, you're young, and say, all my friends, everybody I know wants to see marijuana legal, regulated, and taxed, treated like alcohol, and to emphasize this generational shift in the political powers moving this way. And Eric, of course, has been around town here for past 30 years, understands that the politics of this thing, you're no good as a politician if you don't get reelected. And this is one way to convince your local state senator, state rep, congressman, member of parliament, whatever, that to get on the right side of history, the right side of this issue, would be good politics. And I thank you for that assessment.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Is there anything else, and kind of, I guess, wrapping this thing up, at the federal level, any closing thoughts, recommendations for our audience? What can they do, acting either locally or globally, to move this issue into the history books, this terrible, terrible prohibition?
Well, after you've joined these organizations to get information so you know what to do, you have to give money. This effort does not run cheaply. It can't all be financed by some very generous, wealthy donors. It has to be supported by the grassroots. And you've got to give contributions to groups like Citizens Opposing Prohibition, Marijuana Policy Project, LEAP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, NORML. Money is the mother's milk of politics. These organizations that made sure that Washington and Colorado happened did so based on contributions of people like the listeners to Time for Hemp. I can't stress how important it is. Become a monthly donor to SSDP or LEAP, at $5 or $10 or $15 a month. This is so valuable, and to encourage your friends to do it, or to hold a fundraising party. At some point when people are talking about this, pass a hat. Ask people to donate. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. You're in it. You're in this game. And, until nobody is going to jail for possessing marijuana, until no one is risking getting arrested for marijuana offenses, this is, a really critical matter of your individual liberty. Until everybody who is in prison now for a marijuana offense is freed, we've got a struggle ahead of us.
Thank you, Eric. And I would just say, just in addition to that, or add to it, that, find a politician who agrees with us on this issue and hopefully enough on other issues that you can support them, and then support that politician.
Howard, Casper, this is about all the time for hemp that I have today.
Well, I want to thank you so much. Eric, you are part of our family. You were on the television series back in 1991, and it's just an honor every time to have you on the big broadcast. Thank you. Howard, I want to thank you, too, for being nice enough to be part of this presentation here on Time for Hemp.
Look at all that money, the money that they spent. Take another look and spend some time for him. Don't cut trees for paper, 'cause it hurts the environment. Stop deforestation, yes, it's time for him. Whoa, an acre of hemp makes 20 barrels of oil. No need for pesticides to poison all our soil. People got no food, they got no clothes, they got no rent. Well, time for hemp! Yeah!
NAACP! It's good to be back. How y'all doing today? You doing fine? You look fine. All right, everybody have a seat. I got some stuff to say. I've got some stuff to say. Today I want to focus on one aspect of American life that remains particularly skewed by race and by wealth, a source of inequity that has ripple effects on families and on communities and ultimately on our nation. And that is our criminal justice system. Now, this is not a new topic. I know sometimes folks discover these things like they just happen. There's a long history of inequity in the criminal justice system in America. When I was in the state legislature in Illinois, we worked to make sure that we had videotaping of interrogations because there were some problems there. We set up racial profiling laws to prevent the kind of bias in traffic stops that too many people experience. Since my first campaign, I've talked about how in too many cases our criminal justice system ends up being a pipeline from underfunded, inadequate schools to overcrowded jails. What has changed, though, is that in recent years, the eyes of more Americans have been opened to this truth, partly because of cameras, partly because of tragedy, partly because the statistics cannot be ignored. We can't close our eyes anymore. And the good news, and this is truly good news, is that good people of all political persuasions are starting to think we need to do something about this. So let's look at the statistics. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. I was in college in 1980. Many of you were not born in 1980. That's okay. I remember 1980. 500,000. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. Now, we need to be honest. There are a lot of folks who belong in prison. If we're gonna deal with this problem and the inequities involved, then we also have to speak honestly. There are some folks who need to be in jail. They may have had terrible things happen to them in their lives. We hold out the hope for redemption, but they've done some bad things. Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. Our communities are safer thanks to brave police officers and hardworking prosecutors who put those violent criminals in jail. And the studies show that up to a certain point, tougher prosecutors and stiffer sentences for these violent offenders contributed to the decline in violent crime over the last few decades. Although the science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious, and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community so it couldn't leave segregated areas, but within those areas, there wasn't enough police presence. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. And that is the real reason our prison population is so high. In far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime. If you're a low-level drug dealer or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society. You have to be held accountable and make amends. But you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence. That's disproportionate to the price that should be paid. And by the way, the taxpayers are picking up the tab for that price. Every year we spend $80 billion to keep folks incarcerated. $80 billion. Now, just to put that in perspective, for $80 billion, we could have universal preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old in America. That's what $80 billion buys. For $80 billion, we could double the salary of every high school teacher in America. For $80 billion, we could finance new roads and new bridges and new airports, job training programs, research and development. We're about to get into a big budget debate in Washington, what I couldn't do with $80 billion. It's a lot of money. For what we spend to keep everyone locked up for 1 year, we could eliminate tuition at every single one of our public colleges and universities. As Republican Senator and presidential candidate Rand Paul has said. No, and to his credit, he's been consistent on this issue. Imprisoning large numbers of nonviolent drug offenders for long periods of time costs the taxpayers money without making them any safer. Roughly 1/3 of the Justice Department's budget now goes toward incarceration. 1/3. And there are outstanding public servants at our Justice Department, starting with our outstanding Attorney General, Loretta Lynch. And we've got some great prosecutors here today. And they do outstanding work, so many of them. But every dollar they have to spend keeping nonviolent drug offenders in prison is a dollar they can't spend going after drug kingpins, or tracking down terrorists, or hiring more police, and giving them the resources that would allow them to do a more effective job community policing. And then, of course, there are the costs that can't be measured in dollars and cents. Because the statistics on who gets incarcerated show that by a wide margin, it disproportionately impacts communities of color. African Americans and Latinos make up 30% of our population. They make up 60% of our inmates. About 1 in every 35 African American men, 1 in every 88 Latino men is serving time right now. Among white men, that number is 1 in 214. The bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men, experience being treated differently under the law. And I want to be clear, this is not just anecdote. This is not just barbershop talk. A growing body of research shows that people of color are more likely to be stopped, frisked, questioned, charged, detained. African Americans are more likely to be arrested. They are more likely to be sentenced to more time for the same crime. And one of the consequences of this is around 1 million fathers are behind bars. Around 1 in 9 African American kids has a parent in prison. What is that doing to our communities? What's that doing to those children? Our nation's being robbed of men and women who could be workers and taxpayers. could be more actively involved in their children's lives, could be role models, could be community leaders. And right now they're locked up for a nonviolent offense. So our criminal justice system isn't as smart as it should be. It's not keeping us as safe as it should be. It is not as fair as it should be. Mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it. But here's the good news. Good news. Don't get me preaching now. I am feeling more hopeful today because even now, when, let's face it, it seems like Republicans and Democrats cannot agree on anything. A lot of them agree on this. In fact, today back in Washington, Republican senators from Utah and Texas are joining Democratic senators from New Jersey and Rhode Island to talk about how Congress can pass meaningful criminal justice reform this year. That's good news. That is good news. Good news. That doesn't happen very often. And it's not just senators. This is a cause that's bringing people in both the houses of Congress together. It's created some unlikely bedfellows. You've got Van Jones and Newt Gingrich. You've got Americans for Tax Reform and the ACLU. You've got the NAACP and the Koch brothers. No, you got to give them credit. You got to call it like you see it. There are states from Texas and South Carolina to California and Connecticut who've acted to reduce their prison populations over the last 5 years and seen their crime rates fall. That's good news. My administration has taken steps on our own to reduce our federal prison population. So I signed a bill reducing the 101 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. I've commuted the sentences of dozens of people sentenced under old drug laws that we now recognize were unfair. And yesterday I announced that I'm commuting dozens more. Under the leadership of Attorney General Eric Holder, now continued by Loretta Lynch, federal prosecutors got what he called smart on crime, which is refocusing efforts on the worst offenders, pursuing mandatory minimum sentences 20% less often than they did the year before. The idea is you don't always have to charge the max. To be a good prosecutor, you need to be proportionate. And it turns out that we're solving just as many cases, and there are just as many plea bargains, and it's working. It's just that we've eliminated some of the excess. And recently something extraordinary happened. For the first time in 40 years, America's crime rate and incarceration rate both went down at the same time. That happened last year. So there's some momentum building for reform. There's evidence mounting for why we need reform. And I want to spend the rest of my time just laying out some basic principles, some simple ideas for what reform should look like, because we're just at the beginning of this process and we need to make sure that we stay with it. And I'm going to focus on what happens in three places: in the community, in the courtroom, and in the cell block. So I want to begin with the community because I believe crime is like any other epidemic. The best time to stop it is before it starts. And I'm going to go ahead and say what I've said 100 times before or 1,000 times before and what you've heard me say before. If we make investments early in our children, we will reduce the need to incarcerate those kids. So, one study found that for every dollar we invest in pre-K, save at least twice that down the road and reduce crime. Getting a teenager a job for the summer costs a fraction of what it costs to lock him up for 15 years. Investing in our communities makes sense. It saves taxpayer money if we are consistent about it. And if we recognize that every child deserves opportunity, not just some, not just our own. What doesn't make sense is treating entire neighborhoods as little more than danger zones, where we just surround them. We ask police to go in there and do the tough job of trying to contain the hopelessness when we are not willing to make the investments to help lift those communities out of hopelessness. That's not just a police problem, that's a societal problem. Places like West Philly or West Baltimore or Ferguson, Missouri, they're part of America too. They're not separate. They're part of America like anywhere else. The kids there are American kids, just like your kids and my kids. So we got to make sure boys and girls in those communities are loved and cherished and supported and nurtured and invested in. And we have to have the same standards for those children as we have for our own children. So if you are a parent, you know that there are times where boys and girls are going to act out in school. And the question is, are we letting principals and parents deal with one set of kids and we call the police on another set of kids? That's not the right thing to do. We've got to make sure our juvenile justice system remembers that kids are different. Don't just tag them as future criminals. Reach out to them as future citizens. And even as we recognize that police officers do one of the toughest, bravest jobs around, and we do everything in our power. And as we do everything in our power to keep those police officers safe on the job, I've talked about this. We have to restore trust between our police and some of the communities where they serve. And a good place to start is making sure communities around the country adopt the recommendations from the task force I set up that included law enforcement, but also included young people from New York and from Ferguson. And they were able to arrive at a consensus around things like better training, better data collection, to make sure that policing is more effective and more accountable, but is also more unbiased. So these are steps in the community that will lead to fewer folks being arrested in the first place. Now, they won't eliminate crime entirely. There's going to be crime. And that's why the second place we need to change is in the courtroom. For nonviolent drug crimes, we need to lower long mandatory minimum sentences or get rid of them entirely. Give judges some discretion around nonviolent crimes so that potentially we can steer a young person who's made a mistake in a better direction. We need to ask prosecutors to use their discretion to seek the best punishment, the one that's going to be most effective, instead of just the longest punishment. We should invest in alternatives to prison, like drug courts and treatment and probation programs, which ultimately can save taxpayers thousands of dollars per defendant each year. Now, even if we're locking up fewer people, even if we are reforming sentencing guidelines, as I've said before, some criminals still deserve to go to jail. And as Republican Senator John Cornyn has reminded us, virtually all of the people incarcerated in our prisons will eventually, someday, be released. And that's why the third place we need reform is in the cell block. So on Thursday, I will be the first sitting president to visit a federal prison. And I'm going to shine a spotlight on this issue because while the people in our prisons have made some mistakes and sometimes big mistakes, they are also Americans. And we have to make sure that as they do their time and pay back their debt to society, that we are increasing the possibility that they can turn their lives around. That doesn't mean that we will turn everybody's life around. That doesn't mean there aren't some hard cases. But it does mean that we want to be in a position in which if somebody in the midst of imprisonment recognizes the error of their ways, is in the process of reflecting about where they've been and where they should be going, we've got to make sure that they're in a position to make the turn. And that's why we should not tolerate conditions in prison that have no place in any civilized country. We should not be tolerating overcrowding in prison. We should not be tolerating gang activity in prison. We should not be tolerating rape in prison, and we shouldn't be making jokes about it in our popular culture. That's no joke. These things are unacceptable. What's more, I've asked my Attorney General to start a review of the overuse of solitary confinement across American prisons. The social science shows that an environment like that is often more likely to make inmates more alienated, more hostile, potentially more violent. Do we really think it makes sense to lock so many people alone in tiny cells for 23 hours a day for months, sometimes for years at a time? That is not going to make us safer. That's not going to make us stronger. And if those individuals are ultimately released, how are they ever going to adapt? It's not smart. Our prisons should be a place where we can train people for skills that can help them find a job, not train them to become more hardened criminals. And I don't want to pretend like this is all easy. But some places are doing better than others. Montgomery County, Maryland, put a job training center inside the prison walls to give folks a head start in thinking about what might you do otherwise than committing crime. That's a good idea. Here's another good idea, one with bipartisan support in Congress. Let's reward prisoners with reduced sentences if they complete programs that make them less likely to commit a repeat offense. Let's invest in innovative new approaches to link former prisoners with employers, help them stay on track. Let's follow the growing number of our states and cities and private companies who've decided to ban the box on job applications so that former prisoners who have done their time and are now trying to get straight with society have a decent shot in a job interview. And if folks have served their time and they've re-entered society, they should be able to vote. You know, communities that give our young people every shot at success, courts that are tough but fair, prisons that recognize eventually the majority will be released, and so seek to prepare these returning citizens to grab that second chance. That's where we need to build. But I want to add this. We can't ask our police or our prosecutors or our prison guards or our judges to bear the entire burden of containing and controlling problems that the rest of us are not facing up to and willing to do something about. So yes, we have to stand up to those who are determined to slash investments in our communities at any cost, cutting preschool programs, cutting job training programs, cutting affordable housing programs, cutting community policing programs. That's short-sighted. Those investments make this country strong. We've got to invest in opportunity more than ever. An African-American man born roughly 25 years ago has just a 1 in 2 chance of being employed today. More than 1 in 3 African-American children are growing up in poverty. When America's unemployment rate was 9.5%, when I first came into office, as it was going up, we properly recognized this is a crisis. Right now, the unemployment rate among African Americans is 9.5%. What should we call that? It is a crisis, and we have to be just as concerned about continuing to lift up job opportunities for these young people. Today I've been talking about the criminal justice system, but we have to recognize that it's not something we can view in isolation. Any system that allows us to turn a blind eye to hopelessness and despair, that's not a justice system, it is an injustice system. But that is an extension and a reflection of some broader decisions that we're making as a society. And that has to change. That has to change. What the marchers on Washington knew. What the marchers in Selma knew. What folks like Julian Bond knew. What the marchers in this room still know is that justice is not only the absence of oppression, it is the presence of opportunity. Justice is giving every child a shot at a great education, no matter what zip code they're born into. Justice is giving everyone willing to work hard the chance at a good job with good wages, no matter what their name is, what their skin color is, where they live. 50 years after the Voting Rights Act, justice is protecting that right for every American. Justice is living up to the common creed that says, I am my brother's keeper and my sister's keeper. Justice is making sure every young person knows they are special and they are important and that their lives matter, not because they heard it in a hashtag, but because of the love they feel every single day. Not just love from their parents, not just love from their neighborhood, but love from police, love from politicians. Love from somebody who lives on the other side of the country but says that young person is still important to me. That's what justice is. And in the American tradition, and in the immigrant tradition of remaking ourselves, in the Christian tradition that says none of us is without sin, and all of us need redemption. Justice and redemption go hand in hand. You know, right before I came out here, I met with 4 former prisoners, 4 ex-offenders. 2 of them were African American. One of them was Latino. One of them was white. All of them had amazing stories. One of them dropped out of school when he was a young kid. Now he's making film about his experience in the prison system. One of them served 10 years in prison, then got a job at Five Guys, which is a tasty burger. And they gave him an opportunity, and he rose up and became a general manager there, and now is doing anti-violence work here in the community. One of them, the young Latino man, he came out of prison and was given an opportunity to get trained on green jobs that are helping the environment, but also gave him a marketable skill. And he talked about how the way he's staying out of trouble is he just keeps on thinking about his 2 daughters. And I could relate to that, because you don't want to disappoint your daughters. You don't want to disappoint those baby girls. And so he says, I go to work and I come home and I grab that little baby and get a kiss. And that's keeping me focused. And then one of them, Jeff Copeland, was arrested 6 times before his 38th birthday. He was drinking, using drugs, racked up DUI after DUI, sentence after sentence, and he admits that the sentences he was getting for DUI weren't reflective of all of the trouble he was causing. Could have been worse. And Jeff spent so much time jogging in place in his cell that inmates nicknamed him the Running Man. And he was literally going nowhere, running in place. And then somehow, Jeff started examining his life, and he said, this isn't me. So he decided to hold himself accountable. He quit drinking. He went to AA, met a recruiter from the reentry program at the Community College of Philadelphia, enrolled in classes once he was released, made sure to show up every day, graduated summa cum laude with a 3.95 GPA. And this fall, he'll graduate from Temple University with a major in criminal justice and a minor in social work, and he volunteers helping former inmates get their lives back on track. And it's sort of a cliche, he says, but we can do anything. And just 2 years ago, the Running Man ran his first marathon because he's going somewhere now. You never look at crossing the finish line, he says, of his journey. You attack it by putting 1 mile after the other. It takes steps. It takes steps. That's true for individuals. It's true for our nation. You know, sometimes I get in debates about how to think about progress or the lack of progress when it comes to issues of race and inequality in America. And there are times where people say, oh, the president, he's too optimistic, or he's not talking enough about how bad things are. Oh, and let me tell you something, I see what happens. My heart breaks when I see families who are impacted. I spend time with those families and feel their grief. I see those young men in street corners and eventually in prisons, and I think to myself, they could be me. That the main difference between me and them is I had a more forgiving environment, so that when I slipped up, when I made a mistake, I had a second chance, and they've got no margin for error. I know how hard things are for a lot of folks. But I also know that it takes steps, and if we have the courage to take that first step, then we take a second step. And if we have the courage to take the second step, then suddenly we've taken 10 steps. Next thing you know, you've taken 100 steps, and that's true not just for us as individuals, but that is true for us as a nation. We are not perfect, but we have the capacity to be more perfect. Mile after mile, step after step. And they pile up one after the other, and pretty soon that finish line starts getting into sight, and we are not where we were. We're in a better place because we had the courage to move forward. So we cannot ignore the problems that we have, but we can't stop running the race. That's how you win the race. That's how you fix a broken system. That's how you change a country. The NAACP understands that. Think about the race that you have run. Think about the race ahead. If we keep taking steps toward a more perfect union and close the gaps between who we are and who we want to be, America will move forward. There's nothing we can't do. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, and let me yield now to Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate this, and I've found the conversation here to be very useful, and I think you're highlighting the wide range of issues that are on people's minds. I hope there's an opportunity to continue it. Mr. Botticelli, how many marijuana overdose deaths were there in the most recent year you have available?
To my knowledge, I don't know if there have been instances of specific overdose-related
deaths. You
deaths.
talked about marijuana deaths, and so I want to be clear. I'm trying to trap you.
No.
How many marijuana deaths have there been in the last 5 years?
So if you're referring to overdoses, I am not sure of those numbers. If you're referring to fatalities,
then I would like to have you supply us with how many overdose deaths there were. Because I have heard from experts whose judgment I respect that they don't know of any. So that would be really important for you to provide, at least to me, if not to the committee. What is more dangerous and addictive? Methamphetamines and cocaine or marijuana?
So, I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that there's relative toxicity related to those drugs.
But I'm afraid what's more dangerous and what is more addictive? Cocaine and meth or marijuana? Pretty simple.
I think that conversation minimizes the harm.
No, I'm not trying to minimize the harm. I want to know which is more dangerous and addictive.
Again, I go back as
as
a public health person. One of the things that we look at is not what's the relative risk of one drug.
Okay. Let me just say that I think that your equivocation right there, being unable to answer something clearly and definitively when there is unquestioned evidence to the contrary, is why young people don't believe the propaganda, why they think it's benign. If a professional like you cannot answer clearly that meth is more dangerous than marijuana, which every kid on the street knows, which every parent knows. If you can't answer that, maybe that's why we're failing to educate people about the dangers. I don't want kids smoking marijuana. I agree with the chairman. But if the deputy director of the Office of Drug Policy can't answer that question, how do you expect high school kids to take you seriously?
So, Representative, I didn't mean to be disrespectful, and I didn't mean to indicate that there is not different degrees of toxicity associated with different
I asked
drugs.
what was more dangerous. You couldn't answer it.
No.
And I just want to say that you, sir, represent what's part of the problem. Let me go a little further.
So, sir, that's
Let's
exactly
talk
not
about
what I'm saying.
What kills more people, tobacco or marijuana?
There's been a fair amount of tobacco-associated deaths. My challenge, and the reason I'm hesitating about answering the questions as it relates to relative risk, is I think many times that conversation gets distorted, that there's no risk.
I'm not trying to trap you.
No. But this is why, Representative, I don't want to be disrespectful.
Let me suggest that your inability to answer me whether tobacco or marijuana is more dangerous, again, is part of the problem. Mr. Connolly documented very clearly that we have been able to drop dramatically tobacco use. And it kills more people than marijuana, if you don't know that. But we've been able to drop that without locking people up, without arresting. I think this administration has seen 3 to 4 million people arrested for marijuana since it's been in office. And yet we've been able to drop tobacco use without being coercive. We've been using fact-based advertising, and we've focused our efforts on things that matter rather than things that don't work. And I'd respectfully suggest that you and the department take a step back. If you're concerned that somehow people think marijuana is benign, that part of the reason is that drug professionals can't communicate in ways that the rest of America does. I appreciate your being here, and I welcome any written follow-up to my questions. Because I'm not trying to trap you, but I'm very discouraged by your inability to answer questions.
So let me tell you, this morning I spent the bulk of my morning with a number of parents from across the country who are doing everything they can do to prevent drug use, and particularly prescription drug use, and many of them whose kids have died of an overdose. And I asked them, what more can the federal government be doing in terms of preventing substance use and preventing the tragedies? And they told me they cannot understand why states are moving to medical marijuana and legal medical marijuana. They cannot understand it because they understand from a very acute level the message that legalization sends them. And so this is not from a bureaucrat in Washington. These are from parents who struggle on a daily basis and have been devastated by addiction in their kids. And they understand in a very dramatic and real way that legalizing marijuana sends the absolute wrong message to our youth.
With all due respect, you should be listening to scientists. I understand the parents who are grieved because their child died of an overdose. They didn't overdose on marijuana. And you're listening to them rather than the scientists? Mr. Botticelli, it may go back to A Few Good Men, the movie, Jack Nicholson. You can't handle the truth. The truth is the drug war failed. Your direction on marijuana is a failure. Get to dealing and saving kids from heroin overdoses. My young 22-year-old friend died of a heroin overdose. Yeah, he smoked marijuana, probably the first thing he did. But that's not why he smoked heroin or shot it up. Maybe he did it because he heard people like you saying they're all bad and they're all terrible and you can't deal with the truth. And tell them, well, maybe marijuana doesn't kill you. heroin does and meth does. They're different. And until you deal with the truth, the kids aren't going to believe you at all. Now, you talked about alcohol. Cirrhosis of the liver, pretty serious thing. Violence against spouses and women. People don't smoke marijuana and beat up their wives and girlfriends. They get drunk. Sometimes they beat up their wives and girlfriends. And I know you've got your statistics. I would debate your statistics. And if you get into your statistics about the amount of people who had marijuana in their system who were arrested had fatal accidents, I would submit they probably had other drugs in their system, like cocaine or crack in addition to the marijuana, or they had alcohol and marijuana wasn't the cause. Because what I've understand is people who smoke marijuana, mostly they drive slower and they look out for the cops. They don't drive fast and wild like people do on alcohol and cause deaths. Maybe the reason there's so many more people smoking marijuana now is because they're not listening. And maybe they're doing the other drugs too. But it also shows that the drug war has been a failure. It's been a serious failure. Harry Anslinger started. You know who Harry Anslinger is, don't you?
I do not, unfortunately.
You never? Well, you should, because he's your great-grandfather. He started this war in the 30s, and he was tuned out too. The American public had problems, which sometimes I think we still got them, with Hispanics and Mexicans coming into this country. And it was a war on Hispanics and African Americans. And that's when they made marijuana illegal, was in the 30s. And it was all directed at those people. And Latinos are just as much discriminated against as African Americans in disparate arrests. It still continues to this day. It's 85 years since Anslinger started this. And it's the fact that we spent so much time arresting people is sinful. You talked about the overall effects of marijuana. Again, you can't name one person who's died from an overdose of marijuana, can you?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Right. And you say the cumulative effects. Do you know people, possibly, or heard of people who smoke marijuana who are corporate giants, run banks, run major corporations? Do you know about these people?
Yes, sir, but I also know equal number of people. I know a substantial number of people who also have gone on to develop significant disorders who have smoked marijuana. Again, 1 in 9 people who try marijuana develop a dependency, and we know that particularly those kids who use it earlier in their
kids shouldn't use it. Kids shouldn't use it ever. And at age 18, people shouldn't be arrested for it. Mm-hmm. Maybe it should be 21. But kids shouldn't use it. That's something we all agree on. But the fact is, we need to put our priorities toward heroin and meth. What percentage of your budget goes towards heroin addiction?
So I don't think we necessarily slice our budget, our demand reduction budget, based on drugs. Again, our prevention efforts are focused on preventing drug use.
Isn't that a mistake when people die from heroin in great numbers that the Vermont governor spends his entire state of the state on heroin use? And we don't distinguish and try to save people's lives? That's when you knock people over at the corner store. It's not to get money to buy a donut because you're high. It's to buy heroin because you're hooked. That causes people to die.
Our office in 2011, I think, acknowledged the burgeoning prescription drug and opiate epidemic that we have in the United States. In 2011, we released a plan that looks at dealing with the prescription drug abuse and opiate issues.
Let me ask you, my time's about to run out, and let me ask you one thing. I corresponded back in 2011 with your predecessor, Kierlowski.
Kurlikowski. He's actually the current director now.
Is he? He said back then that there was no particular. They haven't found any medical use. To date, however, the FDA and the Institute of Medicine have not found smoked marijuana to be a safe or effective medicine for any condition, nor has any medical association come out in favor of smoked marijuana for widespread medical use. I think that medical associations have, but are you not aware of the fact that people use smoked marijuana to get them through cancer treatment, nausea?
I do, sir, and it's never been our office's position to either to arrest people who've been using medical marijuana. I think it's important for us, and again, unfortunately, that the FDA is not here. That it's the FDA process that ultimately determines the scientific efficacy of a.
But couldn't you try to influence it? Shouldn't that be part of your job? I had a buddy who was a SEAL. He died of pancreatic cancer. When he was he smoked marijuana at the end. His mother said it's the only thing that makes oral smile or eat. So that was pretty good.
So our role in this is to rely on the FDA scientific process to determine. That's our influencing role, is to rely on the science. I would also say, and I find it unfortunate, and I think I would ask the chairman to invite Dr. Nora Volkow, who's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, because that's where our policy and our science is derived from. We are a science-based office and a policy-based office. And I think if you listen to Dr. Volkow, who is not involved in a political discussion around substance use and marijuana, she will lay out for you the scientific evidence that.
Well, let me ask you this. You are prohibited by law from using any funds to study marijuana legalization for medicinal purposes or any other reason. You're the only office in the federal government that's restricted in that way, and you're required to oppose any scheduling of Schedule I substances, rescheduling like marijuana, that have been approved for medical purposes. Aren't you troubled by these constraints, and don't you think that your expertise should be allowed to be used and study science and contribute to a positive classification of drugs?
Congress put that language in our reauthorization, and I'm actually not. I don't know the background of that.
Would you support legislation to allow you to participate and to voice your opinion and to use science as a basis for your determination?
Well, what I would do is support that federal agencies have the ability to do that. So
yours is prohibited by law. Should that restriction not be lifted?
Again, I think we'd have to have subsequent conversation in terms of.
You mean you think you should be muzzled?
I think that it's important that our office not involve itself in terms of given legislation or given activities. And I believe that was the genesis for that language, that the office not involve itself in state.
But the totality of the drug world, you need to participate. And if you realize that medical marijuana, as 20 states have found, can help people with cancer, with nausea, with those maybe glaucoma. I mean, Montel Williams apparently has some benefits from it. Lots of people do. That you should be able to participate and set our drug policy straight. Mm-hmm. Your job should be to have a sane drug policy, not to be muzzled and handcuffed.
Yeah. From again, my standpoint, I'm happy to engage in fuller conversation, is that has not handcuffed other offices and other federal agencies who are tasked with that work from investigating.
In 1971, Congress created a commission that was headed by Governor Schaefer of Pennsylvania to study federal marijuana policy. That commission came out in favor of decriminalization, but it wasn't put in place. That was 1971. Would you support a new commission to study federal marijuana policy?
So I haven't seen that legislation. I'd be happy to have further conversation.
Would you? It's a concept.
Again, I think we'd be happy to have a conversation in terms of what that might look like.
Thank you, sir. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Now, the last few weeks have been extremely busy, from the Iran deal to Greece's economic meltdown to Donald Trump saying, who gives a shit about what he says? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But in all the excitement, you may have missed one piece of news that got lost in the shuffle.
President Obama tonight granting clemency to 46 nonviolent drug offenders, the most in one day since the 1960s.
Now, that's fantastic, giving nearly 4 prisoners who'd made mistakes a second chance at life. It's basically the criminal justice version of Top Chef's Last Chance Kitchen, but with the chance to walk free as the reward rather than the opportunity to once again disappoint Padma with your risotto. This brings President Obama's total commutations to 89, and that's just counting the humans.
Today I have the awesome responsibility of granting a presidential pardon to a pair of turkeys. You are hereby pardoned from the Thanksgiving dinner table. May you have a wonderful and joyful life of my
Just look at that turkey's face. Even he thinks the annual turkey pardoning is pathetic. Look at it. Just kill me. This is the worst thing that happened to me today, and you just deep-fried my cousin. Presidential clemency has always been controversial, from George W. Bush commuting Scooter Libby's sentence to Bill Clinton pardoning financier Mark Rich to, and this is true, Abraham Lincoln pardoning a man convicted of attempted bestiality because the man was intoxicated at the time. The man in question, John Wilkes Booth. It's true. It's actually not true, but if it had been, that would have been amazing, right? It would have been amazing. And you can read more stuff like that in my book, Stranger Than Truth, John Oliver's 101 Favourite History Lies. But the point is, the president commuting these people's sentences is a big deal because they'd all been subjected to mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which is our topic tonight. Mandatory minimums require judges to punish certain crimes with a minimum number of years in prison, regardless of context, which is a little strange, because context is important. For instance, shouting the phrase, "I'm coming," is fine when catching a bus, but not okay when you're already on the bus. So, circumstances make a huge difference. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, our current mandatory minimums were mostly passed during the tough-on-crime era of the 1980s and 90s, and they're partially responsible for the explosion of our prison population.
Since 1980, the prison population has more than quadrupled. To put that into perspective, that means 1 out of every 100 adults is locked up.
That's true. We have 2 million people incarcerated. If we keep going in this direction, we'll soon have enough to populate an entire new country with prisoners, and trust me when I say that is not a good idea. Literally, the only good thing to come out of that experiment was Hugh Jackman, and that took 180 years. It was worth it, but it was a long time. But it was worth it. It was worth it. But that's 2 centuries, but it was worth it. But mandatory minimums have had a real human cost. Meet one prisoner currently serving time in Oklahoma.
My name is Kevin Ott. My number is 203093. I'm in here for trafficking methamphetamine. I start my 14th year in just a couple of months, and I will be here until I die. Yeah. I have life without parole for 3 ounces of methamphetamine.
He got a life sentence for 3 ounces of meth. That is insane. They're treating him like he's season 5 Walter White when he's barely episode 1 Jesse Pinkman. Now, most of the mandatory minimum drug laws on the books were written in the 80s and 90s when America was in the grips of a full-fledged anti-drug hysteria. It was a time when you could turn on your TV and see this.
This is crack, rock cocaine. It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff.
Little kids doing drugs, it turns my stomach.
It's me. This is my future.
It is if you don't get off those drugs. You use, you lose.
Listen to us. We care about you, Mikey.
There's nothing cool about a fool on drugs.
That last one, you have to hand it to it, that last one had a clear message to kids. Listen, if you do drugs, all your favourite cartoon characters will show up and talk to you. Is that what you want? Is that what you want? So, to fight the perceived drug menace, Ronald Reagan passed tough mandatory minimum drug penalties, and his successor pushed for even harsher laws, justifying them in an Oval Office speech featuring this spectacular moment.
This is crack cocaine, seized a few days ago by drug enforcement agents in a park just across the street from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy.
And now, with the help of this bag's contents, I shall ascend into the cosmos on the wings of a dragon to a place where joy is everlasting and fear is but a memory. Let's do this thing. Let's do this thing, y'all. Woo! We've come it! And look, fun side note here. If you are wondering why someone was dealing drugs in front of the White House, it later emerged the administration asked the DEA to relocate a previously arranged drug sting to make that line in the president's speech true.
The DEA obligingly agreed to move the buy a little closer to the White House. The only hang-up was that apparently the teenage drug dealer didn't know exactly where the White House was.
Now, yeah, it's sad that a teenager got caught up in that sting, but that is an unbeatable prison yard story. That's an amazing breaking and entering anecdote you have. Did I ever tell you about the time I sold crack to the President of the United States? And this was by no means just a Republican issue. Democrats in Congress, state legislatures, and even Bill Clinton also pushed for these laws. And by early 1994, 31 states and D.C. had mandatory minimum sentences for drug offences. They united people from either side of the aisle faster than playing the chicken dance at a wedding. And that is guaranteed to work every time. This is one your auntie knows. But nowadays, that bipartisan tide has very much turned. Everyone from the president to Ted Cruz has spoken out against mandatory minimums. And earlier this year, a bipartisan group of legislators introduced a bill to curb them with this striking statement.
Let me just start off with a challenge to the press and everyone in attendance. Try to find a more diverse political group gathered in one place in the history of the United States Congress.
In fact, I challenge you to find any group as diverse as the 8 men standing before you. I cannot think of anyone who is not represented here. I challenge you. You are challenged. But even people who helped write those laws at the time have turned on them. Take Kevin Ring. He was a congressional staffer who helped push mandatory minimums in the 90s because he believed that they were an effective deterrent. He later went to prison for fraud, and meeting his fellow inmates somewhat changed his mind.
Most of these guys made stupid mistakes without any idea of what the punishment was. They just didn't think they were going to get caught. So you can make the severity off the charts. You can do life sentence for jaywalking. It's not going to stop it.
Of course it isn't. Ridiculously long sentences are not a great deterrent to crime. Prison sentences are a lot like penises. If they're used correctly, even a short one can do the trick. Is a rumour I have heard. And the truth is, mandatory minimums didn't just not work, they ruined lives. Take the case of Weldon Angelos, a non-violent first-time offender. When he was 24, he sold small amounts of marijuana to an informant while he happened to have a gun in his possession. And as a result, he received a 55-year mandatory minimum sentence with no parole. He won't get out until he's 79 for selling something that's currently legal for recreational use in 4 states and whose main side effect is making episodes of Frasier slightly funnier. And he was not the only one affected by his sentence.
His 2 boys were 5 and 7. They were just destroyed. I mean, you could see the sadness in them all the time.
I think it's cruel, and, I'm not saying he doesn't deserve anything, but he did serve his time, and I think he's in there long enough. The minimum should have been, 5 years, maybe. 55 years is way too much.
Yeah, it is. It is way too much. And you know who else thinks that? The judge who sentenced him.
If he had been an aircraft hijacker, he would have gotten 24 years in prison. If he'd been a terrorist, he would have gotten 20 years in prison. If he was a child rapist, he would have gotten 11 years in prison. And now I'm supposed to give him a 55-year sentence? I mean, that's just not right.
So wait, if my math is right here, this low-level pot dealer received the exact same sentence as would an airplane hijacking, child-raping terrorist, a person so evil, I legitimately don't know if one has ever existed. And he's not alone. Many judges oppose mandatory minimums because they essentially hand over sentencing power to prosecutors who can then use the threat of long mandatory minimums to convince defendants to take a plea bargain or to cooperate by providing information. And we have all seen this in action on cop shows.
That heroin we found in your apartment, that kind of weight, got to take that to federal court. Mandatory minimum sentence you're looking at is 10 years. See, we're giving you a choice here, Jimmy. You do the 10 years or you help us on these homicides we're looking at.
Yeah, and you know what? Don't help us out too quickly either, Jimmy. We got 23 minutes left in this episode, so you're going to want to reveal that relevant information in a nice piecemeal fashion. And look, drugs have hurt people, for sure. But the mandatory minimum sentencing laws designed to stop them have done way more harm than good, particularly to certain populations. In 2010, nearly 3/4 of federal drug offenders sentenced under mandatory minimums were black or Hispanic. They affect minorities the way that hockey injuries affect white people. Not entirely, but disproportionately. Now, luckily, at the federal level, we've reduced some mandatory minimums and added safety valve provisions to give judges discretion in certain cases. And on the local level, at least 29 states have rolled back their mandatory minimum laws. But for the most part, those reforms have not been made retroactive, meaning thousands of people are currently stuck in prison for crimes that would carry far shorter sentences if they committed them just a few years later. And that's terrible. Just think about how annoyed you get when people who get seated after you at a restaurant get served and leave before you. Only, in this case, the food is prison food, the restaurant is prison, and dinner takes 55 fucking years. And the thing is, if we go back and fix these mistakes while we still can, the effect can be transformative. Look at Jason Hernandez, who was sentenced to life in prison for dealing drugs, including crack. Watch him read his commutation from the president.
Be it known that I, Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, in consideration of the premises, there's other good and sufficient reasons to be thereunto moving, do hereby grant the said application.
Let me tell you just how moving that is. I'm moved by it, and I'm British. And we are so repressed that crying in public is punishable by exile from the country. I'm only here because I saw the trailer for The Notebook in the theatre. He wrote her every day for a year. Every day for a year. Their first love was their greatest love. There are so many people who deserve to have their cases addressed. Here is just one more. Sharonda Jones, a first-time non-violent offender. She was sentenced to life for her very minor part in a crack cocaine ring. She had an 8-year-old daughter when she went to prison and has had to watch her grow up from inside there.
My dream is to just show up at her school. I mean, I know they gave me life, but I can't imagine not being at her graduation. Her high school graduation, I just can't imagine me not being there.
Here's the thing. That was 8 years ago, and she missed that graduation. And Sharonda was not on the president's list of commutations last week. Nor, incidentally, was Weldon Angelos. And as for Kevin Ott, he couldn't be on the list because he's in a state facility, so his pardon would need to come from the governor of Oklahoma. And look, there should be a lot more pardons and commutations. But if we really want to address this problem permanently, we need states and the federal government not just to repeal mandatory minimums going forward, but to also pass laws so that existing prisoners can apply for retroactively reduced sentences. Because almost everyone has agreed that mandatory minimum laws were a mistake. And we cannot have a system where people are continuing to pay for that mistake and where perhaps their best chance of getting out of a prison that they should no longer be in is somehow finding a turkey costume and hanging around the fucking White House at Thanksgiving.
Guess what corporation makes an estimated $1.4 billion a year off sick prisoners? Meet Corizon, the country's largest prison healthcare company. Corizon treats more than 300,000 prisoners nationwide. The word treats is used loosely.
My son is incarcerated in the Arizona Department of Corrections in Tucson, contracted hepatitis C. It is damaging his liver, and eventually will do the cirrhosis of the liver, go into liver cancer, and will kill him eventually if not treated. He is treatable and curable, but not receiving the proper treatment.
My partner, Thomas Vogt, and he's been incarcerated here in Tucson, Arizona since 1994. He has an enlarged prostate, and there's also a growth there that needs a biopsy. Hello? We're talking about you. Did you get your pain meds yet?
No. I'm in constant pain. I can't even sit now. They just ignore it.
I cannot tell you how many of the same kinds of stories we hear on a daily, weekly basis. This is what we call malpractice in the medical field.
We save money because we skip the ambulance and bring them right to the morgue. Diane Jackson, nurse at Corizon. In fact, they save so much money, they can pay their CEO nearly $1 million.
We are the industry pioneers. We are the innovators. Our team is unmatched in knowledge and passion.
6 employees have resigned after 2 inmates at Metro Corrections here in Louisville died this year.
Now, those employees are not corrections officers, but workers with Corizon, Louisville's jail healthcare contractor.
There's no question that Corizon is profiteering from mass incarceration in this country.
My son's being told they have no protocol for treating anybody with hepatitis C, so they don't have permission to even give them medicine to prevent the hepatitis C.
There are no medical services being provided, in my opinion.
Corizon's getting taxpayer money in 29 states, and they're vying for more.
The profit motive is inherently at odds with the mission of a correctional institution. There will always be a perverse incentive not to rehabilitate, not to treat.
They need help, and we can't help them. The only thing we can do is fight for them.
You are listening to the Time for Hemp Global Broadcasting Network. The only broadcasting network dedicated to ending the global war on drugs on iHeartRadio.
I'm Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico. Last year, my state became the 12th state to allow medical use of marijuana by patients who are seriously ill. Groups like the American College of Physicians, American Nurses Association, and American Public Health Association have all acknowledged the medical value of marijuana. To learn more about medical marijuana and what you can do to help, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thanks.